Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming to join this session where we get to kind of pontificate a bit about what tech for good actually means, and it gives us a chance, I think, also to digest a little bit about what we've heard. I think all the regional winners are really impressive, so I think we're going to be very hard pressed to choose between them. I certainly felt that. But I just thought it would be worth spending a little bit of time this morning, just discussing what do we mean by tech for good. I mean, there's a huge surge of kind of interest in tech for good, especially at the moment, and we certainly, talk about it a lot at Sifted and get approached by people, and I just feel like it's this really slippery concept because tech is tech, right? Tech is never inherently good or bad. It's the way that you use it. And when you look at kind of the types of companies that we've had presenting today, there's just a huge mix again. I mean, I think unquestionably they're all doing good, but they're doing good in very different ways. Some of them are sort of medical breakthroughs, something like CanSense, this is a sort of advancement of science and patients. Then there are others which are maybe more traditionally the kind of, helping disadvantaged groups type of good, right? So I'm really interested having a panel of experts, to speak to about this. I mean, maybe I just wonder, can we go around and tell me what do you think tech for good means for you? Maybe starting with Amelie.
Hello there, Maya. Yeah, I mean, tech for good, it is a general term, right? I think the way I look at it is, are these companies helping to solve some sort of social problem in the world? And, we have lots of companies who are doing, incredible work for, and touching on improving things. And you can talk about, large pharma companies as obviously, solving problems as well. But I think for me, that slight differentiator is when the real purpose of the company is to solve those problems, and that's their priority in the world. So revenue generation is important, but that is to facilitate the work which is being done around that social enterprise, whatever that is.
And do you think it inherently has to be something that wouldn't be done otherwise, that it just wouldn't come into existence out of sort of, say, a commercial reason?
I think that comes into it. And I think that's that point around putting the social benefit before a commercial benefit. And you almost, as someone who ran a social enterprise previously, you almost reverse engineer the commercial side to try and figure out how you can actually achieve that social gain rather than starting from the commercial. And it happens to be something which also has a social benefit.
But then bringing in kind of someone more from the medical point of view, I mean, Neil, I don't know whether you want to weigh in here, because I was struck by how many of these winners are sort of doing something, for the advancement of medicine and patient care. And should we count those? I mean, they're sort of helping everybody, right? Not sort of particularly disadvantaged people. Cancer now touches pretty much all of us at some point.
Sure, yeah, and I think I agree. It's a very difficult thing to define, but I guess from my perspective, for these kind of events, what we're really talking about is something that, to me, fills a niche that isn't there from the medical profession, and also that allows a degree of scale that you wouldn't have otherwise. So there are things that, if you like, could make something we already do a little bit better, but that's almost the things that are going to happen incrementally as part of healthcare. For me, the tech for good thing is when you see something and you go, oh my God, why did we not think of that before? It's such a simple thing that addresses a gap between what's already there as part of the healthcare system. So for me, it's around the scale element, and the implementation thing, I guess, is one of my biggest kind of bugbears generally. We get pictures from people all the time about various things. And when you ask them, well, how are you going to implement this in this hospital then? They sort of say, well, that's not really our problem. You have to sort that out. But actually, if you want it to scale, it should be the problem. You either have to work around that or you have to think how it's going to be done. So that's kind of my, I think, perspective.
And you look at a lot of new technologies for Great Ormond Street Hospital. So I'm just wondering, is it that there are just so many gaps still that are just not being filled by anyone other than maybe sort of a startup coming in with something novel? How big is that gap that we need to kind of bridge with these enterprises?
I think there are clearly almost like two separate areas which are now starting to evolve. One is around what I would call consumer health tech, which is around what are the things that can nudge the public to do something that makes them a bit more healthy, or they manage their condition a little bit better. And then there's the highly specialist things, which are really designed to say, you do this in a healthcare setting, is there a way you could do it better or cheaper or more efficiently? The real skill, though, is understanding how you're going to bolt this on, because the problem with lots of industries, but healthcare especially, is that you wouldn't want to start from where we are because it's so fragmented. But the reality is that's where we are starting from. And we see this not so much with tech, we see this with AI sort of product all the time. In that someone comes up with some algorithm and you say, and it's on a data set they've spent 2 years curating and it works on their particular thing. You say, well, how's that going to work in so-and-so's hospital? And they go, with their data that's just coming out of their routine machines. They go, well, we don't know. That's not our problem.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing of understanding, where does it fit? Where does it fit in the ecosystem, and who's your market, and what are you going to plug it into to actually make a real difference, as opposed to it just being a good idea.
Yeah. And Penny, where do you sit in the kind of the health tech versus other types of tech for good array that we've seen?
I mean, for me, tech for good, it's a bit of a spectrum. I mean, I think at one end, a good corporate company has some kind of purpose to it, even if they're, mainly concerned with making money. I think there's a big chunk in the middle that I'd probably characterize as tech for good, which is having some sort of direct and intentional impact on sort of society or the environment. And then I think the tricky bit is sort of at the other end, you've got the kind of not-for-profit, which is almost falls into the trap of sustainability and funding, and we probably touch on that later. I guess from an investment point of view, I struggle where to place medtech. As Neil says, it's doing a lot of good from an investment point of view and a scaling point of view. It's just got very different challenges, and I mean, I've had some experience that area. Neil's outlined it really, really clearly. Someone who comes up with a solution and says, I'm just going to sell this to the NHS, and that's the end of the conversation, is really not going to get very far. So when I'm thinking about an investment hat, I always kind of think of medtech as having its own unique set of challenges and ecosystem. So I almost, I mean, it is tech for good in a way, but I guess what interests me is stuff in that middle box. So maybe it's helping the environment, it's helping, societies function better.
Yeah, and James and Costa, you were kind of privy to all the sort of the preliminary judging round, so you've really kind of had a broader view of this sector. And I'm just wondering whether maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of what you saw and how you narrowed things down. I mean, maybe starting with you, James, first, in terms of coming to this point to present these 8 companies must have been tricky.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So tech for good for us was very much around, first and foremost, being good for society and good for well-being. So good is part of the DNA of all the regional winners, and equally 99% of all the applications we received. And the common theme really was around improving lives, and that could be education-led, health-led, equality-led, welfare and inclusivity, and then there was a big piece around connectivity and environmental. So back to an earlier point that was made, it was social benefit first, and then if it's the right product, service and opportunity, clearly profitability will follow as that product or service scales in the market.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, having been involved in the regional judging as a facilitator, and overall as well, with Empact being called Empact, it's all about those companies being impact-led from the start and actively measuring that impact, communicating it internally or externally, whether it's reports or infographics, and being transparent about that and what's being done to continue to increase that growth. And in the regional judging, I think that's what a lot of the regional judges had to step back and think about, is getting that balance between the technology and actually the impact and the good, because we had a lot of companies that targeted both, but we had some companies that were highly technical, highly innovative, but the impact wasn't there so much, or we're making a lot of impact, but there wasn't much technology behind it. So it was about getting that balance between the two, I would say.
Yep. And can we talk about the money side? I mean, Penny already came to this in terms of, it strikes me that, the funding is really important. You want things to be self-funding so that they can keep going on. But, is it still tech for good if it makes a profit? I mean, is it, Emily, you're nodding now, right? So I think you've got something to weigh in on that.
I fully believe that you can run a tech for good company and make a profit. I think, and whether you operate as a for-profit or not for profit, for me, I'm not terribly precious about that. But what I do think is that what you do with that profit then matters, right? How you then use that to feed the company, right? What is the purpose of your company? If it is just to deliver dividends to your shareholders, then that's a very different type of company than one which maybe plugs in their profits to do other things, which feed back in. And I think, especially when we're talking to sort of social entrepreneurs, there is always that conversation. And I think this is going back to Penny's point around, where on that spectrum they are as well, as far as people who are running charities versus, CICs or other social enterprises, for example, where, your money allows you to do more. Your money allows you to have a greater impact. So, I would always urge any social entrepreneurs I talk to not shy away from creating sustainable revenue generating businesses, because if you are saying that you want to have a greater impact in the world, the reality is that money allows us to do even more with that. So I can see that as a positive aspect of it.
And when you work with startups and they come and they do, and maybe they really have started from that kind of social impact point of view, and they haven't really figured out the money making aspect, and maybe the way that when you ask them how will you fund yourself, it's sort of, well, okay, we'll get some, we'll get a grant, we'll get some donations, we'll get those sorts of things. I mean, how do you kind of work with them to sort of get them to maybe think about other features of funding?
We do. So actually, for the last 2 years running, we've run an AI for Good accelerator as part of Microsoft. And a big part of that is actually trying to help these companies to build revenue structures. So whether that's working, to build new clients, finding other ways to build money, because I think, if anything, current climates just show how much, if you are depending on just grants and funding from external bodies to run, that puts you in a really vulnerable position as a company. So if you care deeply about the impact your company has, actually being diligent in a fiscal sense to say that you have a certain degree of control over that, I think is really important. Not to say that the grants can't be helpful, but I do see, companies who are just completely dependent on grants in a very vulnerable position, I think, and much more kind of, liable to go under because they don't have independent income in other means.
Yeah, and Penny, I think you work with companies like this as well. What kind of advice do you give, the startups that you will work with who maybe haven't developed that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a pricing background in my secret history, and so I strongly believe if you're adding value, you should be looking at where you're adding the value and what value that has, and that should drive who you're charging and what you're charging them for. And I think sometimes people, particularly down the not-for-profit end, are scared of charging for things, a little bit meek and mild, and think it's a little bit commercial, a little bit dirty. But I think if you're adding value, you shouldn't be afraid to do that. So I think grants and donations have a place in terms of that initial hump of getting started. But I think, like Amali, everyone needs to think about being self-sustainable. And from the work I do in the charity sector, that's a huge pressure there. It's been pretty disrupted by COVID, which turns things upside down. But the trend there has been a lessening in grants, and the not-for-profit sector looking for commercial streams to their revenue as well. So go to where the value is.
Yeah. And when they start to kind of to develop, charge people for things, I mean, are you then do you have any particular models that you think work quite well? I mean, is it a case of sort of maybe getting big corporates to sort of come in and sponsor something, or is it really just or very transactional things that they can do with individuals? And
I mean, it depends entirely on the company, you know, what their business model is. If it's, you know, a B2C model, then you'll be looking at a transactional subscription. You know, if it's more B2B, then you're going to be looking at onboarding, you know, larger clients. So it's understanding who your market is and what value you're adding, and then thinking about what are different mechanisms to monetize that.
Yeah, it was interesting with
it. Be proud.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting with Neatbox, for example, with, you know, sort of making the point about that, you know, businesses could benefit from also sort of the customer loyalty and that comes in. So it felt like that was a sort of a fairly strong business case. Neil, I'm always struck by the fact that I think everybody who pitches an idea to the NHS has really learned to speak in this kind of cost savings language now. You know, there's always a sort of, you know, this will cost the you know, the NHS, you know, or it will save the NHS so and so much. So, I mean, is that kind of? I'm just wondering, you know, is that really the approach that most, you know, of the tech for good companies that come to you should be taking? You know,
there's two bits to this. There's obviously the ultimate thing is patient benefit. The question really is how immediate that is, because if you either have to have something that has a tangible benefit to patients now, or you could argue that actually something you can do that makes the whole system more efficient, and therefore with a given sum of money you can now do more things, you benefit other patients, but the patients who are benefiting might be further down the line. And the reality is that there is this limited, you know, a limited amount of funding, and health services have to decide what they're going to do. So if you save in one area, you can spend in another. I think there's, just leading on from the discussion that we've just had around the money, I think there's a very fundamental thing, and with the NHS and actually with all public sector engagement, is that firstly, the public sector is rubbish at engaging with industry, whether they be startups, SMEs, or big industry. Because on the one hand, there's the move to say you must work with industry, you must help startups, etc. And on the other hand, as soon as you start trying to do any of those things, if anyone makes money, people go, oh, terrible, you're helping people make money. So, and I also don't have the thing of, you have to make money to build, to do more things. So actually making money itself is not an issue. But it does raise an issue of how companies, and let's take startups for example, there's a question in the chat about this, how they should engage with an NHS organisation. Because the biggest problem that NHS organisations have is there is no additional capacity or resource to do this work with a startup. So what you'd ideally like to do is sit with a startup and say, right, let's go through how might this work? Do you understand how the data flow is going to be? Do you understand how this works into the workflow? But that's nobody's job at the moment in the NHS. And that's a fundamental difficulty, I think, that we have to somehow resolve, which is what is that working relationship? And if you say, well, in fact, you'll do this with a startup, what's the relationship between the insight, expertise, value, etc.? And I just don't think that's been kind of worked through. So I think it's a really tricky area. And I suspect it's the same with anything that's kind of public sector, where you've got the same issues.
I'd like to jump in there, Neil, to say, yeah, I totally agree with that. There's so many different entry points into the NHS, and we work with different trusts, working with NIHR, who you know, and often find that people just don't know where to go for what. But also on the other side, clinicians, they've got challenges, and often startups will come forward with solutions to problems that don't exist. So there needs to be like a single entry point where those two can come together. We find a lot of that in our own events when we do the physical events. But I think that's very important for those challenges to be set out so that people can respond to them and put forward their solutions.
Yeah, I hear that, and in terms of teaching people how to navigate the NHS, or teaching startups how to navigate the NHS, I think some of the NHS accelerators I hear getting good results in terms of it's a sort of quick course on this is the structure, this is how it's literally sort of how to go through the procurement process, which I don't know whether that's making any difference. Do you think, Neil?
I think there's two different things here. There's how is a good way for procurement for a big organisation, whether that's the NHS or someone else, and people have noted working with individual trusts, maybe people that you've got a relationship with, versus trying to sell to a region or larger. And in theory, things like NHSX, etc., might help with some of that, although we yet to see if that sort of pans out. But I think the other issue is just around how the relationship will be, because selling your product once it's got to a certain point is one problem you have for healthcare, but you've got a problem much earlier than that, which is you want access to healthcare to do the early bits of developing your product. You haven't got anything to sell yet. You're trying to say, we want to work with you to see if we can get something that's worth selling. And that early bit is really hard because there's no slack in the system. And by definition, startups don't have slack either. They don't have loads of money just to spend on something. So neither side actually has the capacity to do that early bit. And that's where you're going to get the most value.
Well, I feel like we could probably spend the rest of the day discussing just the NHS bit. So I don't want to fall down too far down that rabbit hole because it will. So I wanted to bring this back maybe to some more general thoughts, which was, I think there's kind of two issues around, can this last, and how do we make sure that it doesn't sort of become just an exercise in sort of greenwashing or sustainability or sort of good washing businesses. And so again, maybe starting with you, Amali, obviously Microsoft has done this amazing program with startups, but a lot of people can be very cynical about big businesses' involvement in this. So how do you kind of ride the balance between yes, you do want kind of give corporations the opportunity to be supportive, but make sure that everything does remain very focused on the good bit.
I think where it works best, and I'm obviously hugely biased in this, I do think that it works well at Microsoft. I think the reason it works is because there is resonance between what the companies who we're supporting and what Microsoft is aiming to do themselves. So, there has to be some sort of, I think where it works well, there is some sort of grain of mutual gains, I think, in that relationship. With Microsoft, we obviously have set goals ourselves around, zero carbon by 2030, right? We're working to get that goal, to understand how we can change ourselves as a technology business to be more environmentally conscientious and kind of, think about how we, balance ourselves in the world, I think is really critical. The other thing, which I think for us really makes a difference, is Microsoft have been doing partner sales for about 30 years, right? So when we're working with these companies, these are just more companies who we are folding into the amazing work that we're already doing, which is to help companies to sell to our other clients and help them find innovation. The fact that they are doing something which is, for good in some way, is fantastic and just an extra sort of string to the bow. It's not doing something which is different. We're not going out of our way as far as, doing something which goes against the grain of what we are trying to do as a business. So that alignment, I think, really helps to sell that activity into the business and also get really, I guess the senior stakeholder sponsorship. Claire, who's our chief exec, has been a huge sponsor of our AI for Good program. The reason we get time with her is because she knows that this adds value to the Microsoft business. It adds value to the societies that we operate in. So there is that kind of, I think, win-win situation, I think, between all the different parties.
And do you ever get startups that are a little bit worried about getting involved because they worry about being sort of overshadowed or dictated to by Microsoft?
I haven't come across that, if I'm honest. I would hope not. I mean, You know, we have plenty of stories to tell as Microsoft. We don't need to be taking their stories. We're very happy to celebrate their successes and their stories. And, you know, that's the whole point of why we would bring these companies in, which is to allow them to use our platform, our resources to basically accelerate themselves and you know, their profile as well. So, you know, I would hope that none of them feel that way. And if anything, the opposite, that we help to accelerate their businesses.
Yeah. And Penny, tell us, how does it work on the other end? You know, again, if you're working intensely with a group of startups and they're looking at sort of, say, I don't know, you know, a corporate partnership or whatever, I mean, how do you deal with the sort of potential greenwashing element of that?
And I think we all just have to be kind of critical consumers, don't we? And test and not take what people say as granted. So, you know, the proof's in what they do and what they measure and how they act. I think we work with very early stage startups, so it's as much as, you know, the individuals and what they've done and their credibility as what the company's achieved. And I think it's some of the stuff that Costa said. It's looking at, you know, what's the purpose? How does it run through? Are those things being measured?
Yeah.
Does it flow through every aspect of their business?
And making sure that if you do have sort of, you know, donors or sponsors or whatever, that can never get in the way of the sort of original purpose. And do you have safeguards you can put in place that can help?
No, I mean, I think it's testing people having a clear vision and how that fits into every element of their business. Yeah, I mean, the people we're dealing with is a really, really early stage, so a lot of it is kind of relation and sort of gut feel, and, you know, having loads of metrics at that point. But you know, I think we have to be critical consumers, and if we sniff some greenwashing, call it out.
That's true. And what do you think, James? I mean, I think moving on maybe to the second part of the question is can this last? I mean, this is, or feel free to jump in on the greenwashing point as well. But I'm just wondering, you know, I wanted to sort of move on to this point about this enormous enthusiasm at the moment for sort of remaking the world in a better way as hopefully we start to come out of the pandemic. But, you know, how do we sustain the momentum? And is it a bubble?
Yeah. So I don't think it's a bubble. Tech for good has been prevalent for the last decade. I think where we have seen a change over the last 3 to 4 years has been an acceleration of tech for good alliances as the social conscience of larger corporates has evolved and developed. I do equally believe that the UK and Europe sees a huge opportunity for tech for good to become a destination brand, bearing in mind the quality of the unicorn talent pools we have in the UK and Ireland first and foremost, and across Europe. And again, you know, we haven't necessarily talked about tech for bad, but there would be a social dilemma, and we've seen the impact of some of the tech for bad narrative that has had lots of commentary over the last 3 to 4 months and beyond. So I think we've got an opportunity, first and foremost in the UK and Ireland, to become a destination for tech for good, and for that to be how we continue to grow and develop the digital economy.
Yeah, and Costa, what are you sort of seeing? Again, you know, you've got a very wide view, but the companies that you speak to, are they, you know, again, they might be getting a lot of attention now. How are they planning for the long term, though?
Yeah, I mean, on the corporate side first, I think accountability is crucial here. Not just having like a half-hearted commitment from a corporate just to look good, but actually it's like written in your mission. I've seen some companies have it in their articles of association or run annual impact reports. And I think the intent's important in terms of like why that corporate's working on this project. And I'd say also from the startup side, it's important that they don't also wash that they're tech for good if they're not tech for good. If they're trying to, one of our judges said, throw spaghetti at the wall and hope it sticks, or try to fit themselves in a box just to like look good. I think that balance is very important on both sides, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Now, I am hugely conscious of time. I think we have to sort of let the next session come on to talk to some of the panelists. So perhaps that's a moment to end. And thank you very much, everyone, for kind of discussing this
Yeah, thank you for that.
with us.
Thank you,
And great
Maya.
questions from in the chat as well. So thank you all.
Yeah, I would say thank you so much for everybody for joining us. So our 4 judges are going to head over to a private judging session, and we're going to head over to the growth session, which I'll be chairing. Thank you, Amali, for joining us and for all your support with Microsoft for Startups. And thank you, Maya, as well, for chairing this panel. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting us, Neil.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Costa.
Take care. We'll head over to the next one.